The first alarm didn't come from a battlefield, but from a quiet wooden desk buried inside a German mail inspection office. A censor, half asleep and numb from hours of reading grief-soaked letters, suddenly sat upright as though someone had slapped him. In his hand lay a POW message from across the Atlantic. Just a few calm sentences written in an officer's disciplined script. But one line, underlined once with unsettling confidence, felt like treason wrapped in ink. America treats us so well that some here call it paradise on earth. No threats, no codes, no desperate pleas. Just a truth so clean and unguarded that it rattled the room louder than artillery. It was the kind of line the regime feared most, not because it was dangerous, but because it was honest. Only weeks earlier, that same colonel had marched through the wreckage of the Falaise pocket, exhausted, starving, and certain capture meant the worst. Nazi propaganda had done its work well. Posters in German towns warned that American soldiers mutilated prisoners. Leaflets insisted that surrender meant torture. Commanders told their men that the Americans were mongrel cowboys, crude and violent. Even seasoned officers, men who had survived the Eastern Front, felt a cold unease at the thought of falling into Allied hands. The colonel, a 47-year-old career officer who had lectured cadets about duty and sacrifice, carried those fears with him as he boarded a troopship bound for a country he knew only from caricatures. His first sight of America emerged through a fog that clung to the docks like a curtain refusing to rise. Guard towers, floodlights, the silhouettes of soldiers. Every detail reinforced his dread. But something was wrong. Or rather, something was missing. No shouts, no blows, no theatrical displays of dominance. The Americans seemed almost bored, as if receiving German officers was merely another logistical task sandwiched between loading crates and checking manifests. A sergeant glanced at the newly arrived prisoners and muttered, "All right, gentlemen, welcome to camp. Let's get you sorted for dinner." Dinner. The words sounded like mockery, yet it was delivered casually, with no hint of cruelty. Inside the camp gates, the colonel braced himself for the worst. Instead, he stepped into an environment that felt impossibly organized, clean, even quietly humane. Wooden barracks lined in neat rows. A medical building. A small chapel. Fences, yes, but no snarling dogs or guards waving pistols. The scent in the air was not filth or decay, but something warm. Stew, thick with potatoes and vegetables. The colonel thought it must be for the guards. Surely prisoners received scraps. But no, the stew was for them. A lieutenant with an easy smile informed the newly arrived officers that the Geneva Convention of 1929 guided every aspect of the camp's operation. Their meals, he explained, must equal the calories provided to American soldiers. At that moment, the colonel realized he had eaten more in one evening in captivity than he had during his last 5 days of retreat. That first night, he lay on a cot that didn't sag beneath him. The mattress was thin but clean, with a wool blanket still holding the faint scent of detergent. To a man who had slept in bombed-out buildings and frozen forests, it felt almost luxurious. He tried to remain cynical. This had to be a facade, a strategic performance stage for psychological effect. But illusions rarely tasted this real. His stomach, full for the first time in weeks, made its own argument. The next morning delivered the second shock. The camp doctor, an American captain in his early 30s, walked the barracks with a clipboard, examining every new arrival. When he reached the colonel, he adjusted his glasses and asked, in unaccented German, how long he'd been dealing with chest tightness. The colonel stiffened, reluctant to share anything that might be used against him. Yet the doctor was not interrogating. He was diagnosing. Within minutes, the colonel was escorted to the infirmary, where he received treatment for a condition he had ignored for months. The medical equipment gleamed. The staff moved with gentle efficiency. It was an unsettling experience, being treated by the enemy as if he were one of their own. Later that week, he witnessed something even more disorienting. A transport of enlisted POWs arrived from another camp, and several were too weak to stand. The American guards didn't shout or strike them. Instead, they carried the emaciated soldiers, men who had once served under him, to the hospital wing. The colonel watched as blankets were draped over their shoulders and canteens pressed to dry lips. He forced himself to look away, embarrassed by the unexpected sting of emotion. He had not seen such careful treatment of wounded men even within parts of his own army. The camp was not paradise, not yet. It was still fenced, still guarded, still a symbol of defeat. But slowly, the colonel discovered small, disarming gestures that unraveled his certainty. One morning, he found a stack of German newspapers in the recreation hall. Another day, he heard laughter drifting from a nearby volleyball match where prisoners and guards seemed indistinguishable except for their uniforms. At the canteen, POWs purchased cigarettes with their earned coupons. 80 cents a day, fair compensation for labor they volunteered for. The colonel's worldview, once rigid as iron, began to bend under the weight of an unexpected truth. The Americans were following rules the Reich had ignored, and doing so with an almost stubborn sense of principle. He sensed a shift among the other officers as well. Conversations grew more reflective, more questioning. They whispered at night, not of escape attempts, but of the strange civility surrounding them. One colonel wondered aloud whether the Americans treated them so well to shame them. Another suggested the Americans simply didn't care enough to hate them. Whatever the reason, the effect was the same. Fear dissolved, replaced by a cautious, reluctant respect. When he finally sat down to write the letter, the one destined to alarm German censors, he chose his words carefully. He spoke of good treatment, of unexpected kindness, of a system that functioned with efficiency instead of intimidation. And then, almost involuntarily, the phrase escaped him, paradise on earth. He hesitated, pen hovering above the page, knowing it was too bold, too honest. Yet he left it. He wanted someone back home to know the truth, even if it contradicted everything they had been taught to believe. What he did not know, could not know, was that the letter would not be forgotten. It would linger in the mind of the officer who read it, ripple quietly through rumors in Berlin, and later emerge as one of the earliest cracks in a carefully constructed wall of lies. And as the colonel sealed the envelope, he sensed, faintly, that captivity had not broken him. It had awakened him. But the true revelation of what this awakening meant, both for him and for the world he left behind, was still waiting just beyond the next horizon. The first morning the colonel stepped into the camp library, he felt as if someone had staged an elaborate trick. Shelves of German classics, English novels, philosophy texts, and history volumes lined the walls, their spines unbroken, their pages clean. A potbelly stove crackled softly in the center of the room. Sunlight spilled across long tables where POWs sat reading in near-monastic silence. It was so far removed from the image of American barbarism he had been taught to expect that he paused at the threshold, wondering if the guard were watching for his reaction. But no one seemed to care. The Americans treated the library as casually as they treated the kitchen or the barracks, as if intellectual space was simply another necessity, not a privilege. That same day, he discovered the rhythm of camp life, structured, predictable, almost soothing. At dawn, roll call. At mid-morning, work assignments. In the afternoon, recreation or classes. The colonel had prepared himself for humiliation, but instead he found bureaucracy. The Americans loved procedure, loved order, loved clipboards and regulations. Every guard seemed to carry a small notebook, scribbling notes about schedules, inventories, and maintenance. It was strangely reassuring, as if the entire system ran on rails no individual cruelty could derail. One guard, noticing the colonel's curiosity, joked, "Sir, the only thing we torture here is paperwork." The colonel allowed himself the faintest smile, his first in weeks. Work details were voluntary, another surprise that unsettled him. Prisoners were invited, not forced, to take on agricultural jobs, carpentry, or camp maintenance. Payment came in the form of coupons redeemable at the canteen. 80 cents a day, enough to buy cigarettes, postcards, even small treats. The colonel watched, half bemused and half embarrassed, as enlisted men lined up for chocolate bars like schoolboys who had discovered an unexpected holiday. The American guards didn't seem to mind. Some even traded stories or shared tips on how to roll better cigarettes. It was a kind of casual humanity that could not be faked. The recreation grounds were even more bewildering. Fenced though they were, they felt nothing like a prison yard. Soccer fields stretched out across trim grass. A volleyball net hung between two posts. In one corner, a group of POWs practiced boxing, while another group rehearsed a small orchestra. The colonel had expected desperation, secrecy, tension. Instead, he found men rebuilding fragments of normal life. When the orchestra played a familiar Schubert melody one warm evening, even the guards slowed to listen. A few stood at the perimeter, arms folded, heads bowed slightly as if acknowledging that beauty did not belong to one nation alone. Classes offered yet another angle of contradiction. Some were taught by American guards who had once been school teachers, others by local university volunteers. English grammar, mathematics, mechanical engineering, even introductory philosophy. The colonel attended a lecture out of curiosity, sitting stiffly in the back as a young American explained the structure of democracy using chalk diagrams that squeaked on the board. At one point, the instructor asked the class whether laws should bend to the needs of the state or the dignity of the individual. The room went silent. The colonel could feel the weight of the question pressing against his chest, heavier than any lecture he had given to cadets back home. Yet the camp's most striking feature was its predictability. Rules were enforced not with anger, but with quiet firmness. A guard who caught two POWs arguing loudly simply raised a hand and said, "Not here, fellas. Take it outside or calm it down." There were no threats, no intimidation. Infractions were documented and processed through a system so thoroughly regulated that it seemed designed to eliminate emotional volatility entirely. The Americans had taken the chaos of war and replaced it with something almost mechanical in its fairness. But not all revelations were gentle. One afternoon, the colonel witnessed a confrontation between a German officer and an American sergeant. The German, humiliated by defeat, accused the sergeant of treating him with insufficient respect. The sergeant listened patiently, then replied, "Sir, respect is earned by how you act now, not what rank you wore somewhere else." The word struck the colonel harder than he expected. It was not an insult, but a principle, and one that carried a sting of truth. He later replayed the moment in his mind, realizing how deeply the Reich had tied honor to hierarchy rather than conduct. In letters home, always censored, always watched, POWs attempted to describe these contradictions without revealing too much. Some wrote about the food, others about the classes or medical care. A few deliberately understated conditions to avoid suspicion. But quietly, in conversations whispered after lights out, they admitted the same reality. Captivity here had given them room to breathe, to think, to question. The colonel felt it happening within himself, a slow uncoiling of assumptions he had carried for years. He did not yet dare articulate it, but he sensed that the war had not only captured his body, it had freed parts of his mind he didn't know were bound. The contrast between expectation and reality sharpened each time news from home arrived. Germany was starving. Cities lay in ruins. Civilians dug through rubble for firewood. Meanwhile, POWs in America gained weight, played sports, studied languages, and listened to music. It created a kind of moral dissonance the colonel struggled to reconcile. How had the enemy, portrayed as uncivilized, managed to uphold a standard of treatment his own regime could not, or would not, match? Rumors spread through the camp of men who dreaded repatriation, not because they loved captivity, but because they feared the world waiting for them outside the wire. The colonel found himself thinking about that more often than he wanted to admit. He had always believed his loyalty was unshakable, anchored in duty and sacrifice. But the quiet decency of the Americans had begun to erode the barriers he had built to protect that belief. One evening, he noticed a group of POWs gathered around a guard who was showing them photographs of his family. The guard pointed at a young child, laughing as he explained how she had tried to feed their dog a spoonful of oatmeal. The colonel lingered at the edge of the group, watching the exchange. There was nothing staged about it, no performance, just a man sharing a piece of his life with those he had been told to see as enemies. As he turned away, a question surfaced, unwelcome, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. If the men he had feared for so long were capable of such ordinary kindness, then what else had the Reich lied about? He did not yet know the answer, but he felt the ground shifting beneath him, and as the camp settled into its nightly quiet, with the orchestra practicing somewhere in the distance, he sensed that the truth he was approaching would not just challenge his loyalties, it would overturn them. Winter crept into the camp with a quiet persistence, settling over the barracks like a thin veil of frost. The colonel, now months into captivity, had adjusted to the strange equilibrium of his new life, yet he still carried the residue of suspicion, an instinct shaped by years of propaganda and discipline. But the night everything shifted arrived without ceremony. A cold wind rattled the roof of the recreation hall as the camp orchestra gathered for its weekly rehearsal. The colonel attended only because he could not sleep. Rest had become more difficult as news from home painted a picture of a Germany unraveling faster than any of them had expected. He slipped into a seat near the back, the wood creaking softly under his weight. The musicians tuned their instruments, and for a moment, the room held the same fragile tension that preceded an artillery barrage. Then the first notes of Schubert's Ave Maria floated through the air, pure, fragile, unguarded. The colonel closed his eyes, letting the melody settle in the hollow places grief had carved within him. When he opened them, he noticed something unexpected. 2 American guards stood outside the open door, leaning against the frame to listen, their breath clouding in the cold. They didn't move, didn't speak, didn't posture as conquerors. They simply listened. The colonel watched them, the music blurring into a soft hum behind his thoughts, and realized he was witnessing something the Reich had never prepared him to understand, an enemy capable of reverence for the beauty created by those they fought. The next morning delivered another jolt. During a work detail near the supply shed, one of the older POWs collapsed in the snow. His legs buckled beneath him, sending him into a heap of shivering limbs. Before any German could react, an American guard sprinted forward, shrugging off his own jacket and draping it over the fallen man's shoulders. The guard called for a medic with a voice full of urgent concern, as though the man at his feet were a comrade rather than a prisoner. The colonel, standing only a few meters away, felt something unravel inside him. Compassion was supposed to be a weakness of the Allies, sentimentality that the Reich claimed would cost them victory. Yet here it was, fierce and instinctive, shown not to civilians or dignitaries, but to an enemy soldier who had no strategic value whatsoever. Later that week, the colonel himself experienced a more personal moment of dissonance. He had been suffering from recurring chest pain, the consequence of years of unrelenting duty and miles of marches through snow and mud. The camp doctor, noticing the strain in his posture, insisted on further examination. The colonel tried to resist. Revealing vulnerability to an enemy felt like a betrayal of everything he had been taught. But the doctor ignored his protests, guiding him gently toward the infirmary. Inside, an American nurse placed a warm compress on his chest, her expression calm and focused. Another brought him water. No one asked for thanks. No one mocked his condition. As he lay on the examination table, the colonel felt a profound disorientation. He had been prepared for hostility, but not for this. This quiet insistence that even an enemy deserved care. That night, unable to sleep, he walked the perimeter of the camp, his boots crunching softly in the frozen dirt. Lanterns glowed from the barracks, casting long shadows across the ground. He could hear the muffled murmur of conversations. Men talking about families, about old memories, about whether they would return to anything that resembled a home once the war ended. He paused near the fence, staring at the darkness beyond. For the first time, the wire did not feel like a barrier imposed by strangers. It felt like the outline of a world that had grown unexpectedly safe, while the one he left behind descended into chaos. A turning point arrived in the form of a simple conversation. One evening, after roll call, an American sergeant approached the colonel as he stood alone near the mess hall. The sergeant carried 2 cups of coffee, thin, bitter, unmistakably American. He offered one without ceremony. The colonel hesitated before accepting it, more out of politeness than desire. They stood in silence for a few moments, the steam rising between them like a fragile bridge. Then the sergeant spoke. "War makes fools of all of us," he said, "but it doesn't have to make us monsters." The colonel studied his face, searching for mockery, for superiority, for anything that could be used to preserve the familiar boundaries between them. But the sergeant's expression was sincere, almost weary. It was a truth spoken without calculation. The colonel carried that sentence with him for days. It echoed in his mind during meals, during work, during the quiet hours before dawn. It joined the growing collection of observations he could no longer ignore. The guard who shared cigarettes despite shortages. The doctor who treated every patient with the same steadfast commitment. The musicians who played not to impress, but to remember who they were. These moments, small and fragile, formed the threads of a truth powerful enough to unravel decades of indoctrination. But the moment his mind truly changed, the moment the shift became irreversible, came with the arrival of a new group of prisoners transferred from Europe. They shuffled into camp thin, hollow-eyed, and defeated. When the Americans saw their condition, they reacted with something close to outrage. Not at the prisoners, but at the suffering inflicted on them. Extra rations were prepared, new blankets distributed, and medical staff mobilized with urgency. The colonel watched the scene unfold from a distance, feeling an ache bloom in his chest. These men, once proud soldiers of the Reich, had been saved not by the nation they served, but by the nation they fought. That night, alone in his bunk, the colonel finally allowed himself to see the full scope of the lie he had lived under. The propaganda that painted the Americans as savage had crumbled under the weight of lived experience. What remained was a truth he could no longer deny. The enemy had preserved his dignity more faithfully than his own leaders ever had. And yet, as the colonel drifted into uneasy sleep, a troubling realization flickered in the back of his mind. A realization he could not yet name. If the Americans had not been the monsters, then someone else must have been. And the answer to who that someone was waited for him in the final, harsh letter he had not yet read. Spring crept into the camp with a kind of reluctant warmth, softening the frost along the fences and turning the frozen dirt into patches of tender green. It brought with it the news every prisoner had been waiting for and dreading in equal measure. Repatriation orders had begun. The war in Europe was collapsing, cities were falling, and the German high command was dissolving faster than paper and rain. For the colonel, the announcement came during morning roll call, spoken in the same clipped, matter-of-fact tone the Americans used for everything from meal schedules to work assignments. Transport leaves in 3 days, the guard said. Pack what you've been issued, and travel light. Travel light. He almost laughed at the irony. He had arrived burdened with fear, pride, and a lifetime of certainty. He would leave with none of those intact. In the final days before departure, the camp felt strangely restless. Men who had built routines, reading in the library, working in the fields, playing soccer, found themselves lingering at the edges of familiar spaces, as if trying to memorize them. The colonel watched one prisoner run his hand along the smooth surface of a dining table, tracing the grain of the wood as though it held some important memory. Another stood near the infirmary door, staring at the place where American nurses had once tended to him. The colonel understood. This camp, fenced though it was, had become a quiet refuge from the chaos of a world they no longer recognized. He packed his belongings in silence. An American-issued blanket, 2 postcards he had never mailed, a small book of English phrases the librarian insisted he keep. The blanket troubled him most. It was warm, durable, and unambiguously marked U.S. Army. He hesitated each time he folded it, unsure whether to feel gratitude or shame. The blanket represented comfort, yet also a reminder that the enemy had cared for him more reliably than the leaders he once served with unquestioning loyalty. On the final morning, the camp buzzed with a nervous energy. Trucks waited beyond the gates, engines rumbling like distant thunder. The colonel joined the line of men moving toward the exit, their boots sinking slightly into the thawing earth. As he approached the gate, he saw the American sergeant who had once handed him a cup of bitter coffee, standing to the side, arms crossed loosely over his chest through a makeshift repatriation center, where German officials in worn uniforms attempted to look authoritative despite their frayed insignia and exhausted faces. They asked questions with a mechanical efficiency that lacked the warmth and discipline the colonel had grown accustomed to. After his debriefing, he stepped outside and felt the weight of the moment settle into his bones. Germany had not only been defeated, it had been hollowed out. The structures of belief he had once relied upon looked as broken as the buildings surrounding him. In the weeks that followed, he traveled through what remained of his country, moving from one shattered town to another in search of surviving relatives. Along the way, he met other former POWs, officers, enlisted men, civilians who had endured captivity in various Allied camps. Conversations unfolded in quiet corners of ruined train stations and cramped temporary shelters. Many echoed the same sentiment. The Americans had treated them with a fairness they could not explain, even when it served no strategic purpose. Some described it as dignity. Others called it mercy. A few, more reflective, suggested it was evidence of a system built on principles rather than fear. The colonel listened, recognizing their words as fragments of truths he had carried home as well. One evening, in the rubble of what had once been his hometown, the colonel unwrapped the American blanket and draped it around his shoulders. He sat on a piece of broken stone wall, staring at the ruins of his childhood street. The blanket's softness contrasted painfully with the cold, jagged world around him. He closed his eyes and remembered best. Their eyes met, and the sergeant offered a nod, small, almost imperceptible, but weighted with a respect that startled the colonel. For a brief moment, he considered stepping out of line, offering a proper farewell, perhaps even a handshake. But the line continued forward, carrying him with it before he could decide. The journey across the Atlantic felt longer than the voyage that had brought him to America. The ship was crowded, the air thick with the sound of murmured worries and the creaking of metal bulkheads. The colonel stood at the rail often, watching the slow churn of water beneath the hull. He thought about the years he had served the Reich, the speeches he'd given, the cadets he'd trained, all with the conviction that he served a nation of unmatched virtue. Yet it was the enemy who had shown him discipline without cruelty, strength without brutality, compassion without hesitation. He tried to reconcile these truths with what he had believed, but the more he tried, the more the contradiction grew unbearable. When the ship finally reached Europe, the contrast was jarring. The first city he saw lay in ruins, flattened buildings, shattered roofs, streets cloaked in ash. Civilians wandered like ghosts through the debris, carrying buckets, broken carts, or nothing at all. Children stared with hollow, cautious eyes. The air smelled of dust, smoke, and something sour he could not name. Whatever fragile hope the colonel had carried across the water faltered at the sight of the devastation. It was not the homeland he had imagined returning to. It was the aftermath of a vision that had consumed itself. The colonel and his fellow officers were processed at the camp library, the orchestra rehearsals, the guard sharing a cigarette, the nurse adjusting his bandages. Small moments, but each one a quiet rebellion against the cruelty that had shaped the war. He had returned to a country, searching for meaning in the aftermath of collapse. Yet the meaning he found did not come from ideology or victory. It came from the simple, stubborn humanity he had witnessed in the place he least expected it. He carried that truth with him now, not as a burden, but as a compass, a reminder that dignity could survive even when nations fell. As night settled over the ruins, the colonel lifted the corner of the blanket close to his face. Printed on it, barely visible in the fading light, were the letters he knew by heart. U.S. Army. The emblem glowed faintly, a symbol of the unexpected mercy that had reshaped his understanding of the world. And as he sat there, wrapped in the warmth of his former enemy, he realized he had returned home with more than just memories. He had returned with a truth powerful enough to outlive the rubble around him. That's it for today's story. And before you go, please tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories reach. And please support us by liking the video and pressing the hype button for the video after that. It helps us a lot.